This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome into Slick Talk. I'm your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. On today's episode, aptly titled YouTube and You, I have a three-piece for the people. That is three different avenues of YouTube, all having to do with Blackstone and what we do with oil analysis in the form of a Q&A, specifically answering a question that was left on one of our podcast uploads. Something of a ChatGPT misadventure, and finally, a shout out to another channel and their most recent upload. But let's get things started off by responding to a question left on episode 161. This was in relation to calendar time, whether or not that matters for engine oil. And in that episode, we delved into an example of a sample where it was able to be left in use for years and had no trouble having been in the engine for that long. The oil did not break down. The engine looked great. And that episode was just one example of why we tell people they don't need to change the oil based on calendar time. And one listener asked us, quote, "This sounds like a garage storage vehicle. What would the outcome be for a vehicle stored outdoors or not climate controlled? How much would moisture play a part? Would that contribute to degradation of the oil and or the creation of more insolubles found in the sample?" Now, I don't know whether or not this vehicle that we discussed in episode 161, if it was kept in a garage or not. That's information that's simply beyond the scope of what was provided on that oil analysis slip, as well as the vast majority of samples sent our way. You know, we're often lucky to know what brand or blend the owner is using, let alone whether or not the vehicle is climate controlled. But nevertheless, we were able to look through the files and find a few examples of samples where the owner did make mention not only of the vehicle being stored outside, but for long periods of time with that oil in use. And I want to break down mainly the physical properties, but I'll also touch on some of the wear-related results. But it seems like the question that the listener asked mostly had to do with the oil's physical properties and whether or not there were, more insolubles or if the oil had otherwise shown signs of breaking down. So first of all, we're going to look at a sample from a Suzuki. This is a DL650V twin powering a 2004 Storm. And in this particular instance, the owner did make mention of the bike being stored outdoors. That was a concern for them. Now, as for the physical properties, we're looking at a viscosity that was a little low, but here's the thing, it's a motorcycle engine, so you're not really going to run into a viscosity that's normal most of the time. In fact, it's probably more often than not that I see a viscosity that's a little below spec, and that doesn't have anything to do with climate. It's just due to the fact that motorcycle engines tend to harmlessly shear the oil down. So not really surprised to see a low viscosity. And in general, if motor oil is breaking down due to factors such as, moisture causing rapid oxidation or excess heat, the viscosity is usually going to go the other way. It's going to end up high. It's not really going to just skew to the low end, but it will do that for engines that harmlessly shear. And again, not really having to do with storage as much as a fact of life for the engine type that it is. So the viscosity was low, not really a concern or a surprise. The TBN, for those interested in that particular test showing active additive remaining, it was plenty strong. In this particular instance, the TBN was 5.6. And really, we don't consider it to be low until it's 2.0 or less. And even then, you can typically rely on other factors to gauge whether or not that oil really needed changed. But I digress. Speaking to this particular instance, we're looking at a bike stored outdoors, and the TBN was still plenty strong, and this oil, for reference, had about 6,000 miles on it. So by no means a short interval, at least relative to the 4,300 mile average for that engine type. So nothing to be concerned with there. Again, that was a Suzuki DL650 V-twin, and a great example of why storing outdoors and having that oil in use for even a longer than average run didn't cause any issues. Next up, I have a 1975 Beetle powered by VW's air-cooled 1.6. This particular engine was stored outdoors as well. But in this case, and just to backtrack to that Suzuki sample, no water either in the Suzuki or in this VW. So moisture accumulation, not a concern, regardless of being stored outdoors. And even for this engine being a 1975, we talk about modern engines not really being susceptible to moisture buildup, but not only is there no water, we aren't seeing signs of corrosion in the metals either. And corrosion, for reference, can typically affect these cylinders. And in this particular instance, we have cylinder area wear looking really good. That is going to be evident in the levels of aluminum, chrome, iron. Those are your cylinder area metals. Corrosion, if it's rampant, can really drive up aluminum and iron specifically. And neither metal looked remotely high compared to averages. And even better, the oil, in terms of contaminants, it only had less than 1% fuel, 0.8 based on the flash point. So if you are not familiar with fuel dilution and what we tend to view as a problem, usually it takes 2% to bring about the possibility of an issue. And then amounts that are higher than that, especially on a recurring basis, that's really when you start to suspect a fuel system issue. So not a concern here at just 0.8%. But the listener was asking about insolubles as well, the solids that show oxidation. So what about those? Well, in this case, as in the other instances I've also been delving into here, insolubles are well below the 0.6% we consider high. And when I talk about 0.6%, that's in reference to the sample volume. So a level below 0.6%, for our money, that tells us that the oil filter was really doing a good job and wasn't overwhelmed with oxidized solids. If there's a problem, be it moisture causing oxidation or the oil and the oil filter simply being in use too long, then we can find high insolubles in the sample, and that's simply not the case. 0.2% in this particular sample I'm discussing from the 1975 VW 1.6, the air-cooled motor, and you can really do a whole lot worse than 0.2%. That level indicates that whatever oxidation was taking place, it was nowhere near what would overwhelm an oil filter. So good stuff there. And again, it's another sample with no moisture that accumulated despite the owner noting that the vehicle was stored outdoors. Now, what about a more extreme example? An engine that had been sitting in a field for 10 plus years. Surely there could be some water or excess insolubles from the oil breaking down, right? Well, no, because this sample is yet another one that had no water in it, no measurable water anyway. And we also found insolubles way below the 0.6% we consider high. Now, that isn't to say it was a, rose-colored lenses situation completely, in the sense that there was some excess metal and silicon present, but I wouldn't necessarily associate that merely with the engine having been sitting in a field for 10 plus years. When you have silicon end up high along with metals, it's possible that is dirt contamination that is causing or was causing excess wear. I speak of that in the past tense because not only are we a few years removed from the sample at this point, things improved from there. We have multiple samples in the more modern era, we'll say. This sample was from a 6BT 5.9 powering a Ford F800. It looked a whole lot better in the samples to come. And that tells us that the excess silicon and the wear levels that were testing high, that could either be due to, say, dirt contamination causing excess wear at the pistons, the rings, the cylinder liners. Or maybe the sample was taken after a repair and that was wear material. Whatever the case may be, we found progress moving forward. So it certainly wasn't lasting damage due to the engine sitting. There wasn't moisture that could have been due to the engine sitting. Insolubles were low. So those are just a few examples from, a rather diverse array of engines and situations. And, you have a motorcycle, you have a tractor that was sitting in a field for 10 plus years. You have a 1975 VW. I mean, we see samples from a wide range, and they all give us a similar narrative in that you're not just going to wind up with water, and you're not bound to wind up with the oil breaking down and resulting in there being a lot of oxidized solids present merely from sitting. So once again, we can lean on the actual use, hours, miles, to determine when you should be changing that oil. It's not merely time that's going to decide that oil's lifespan. Now we're going to switch gears to a whole different avenue of YouTube, and that is discussing a video we became aware of recently. I don't want to link to the video because, frankly, I just don't want to give it any more viewership than it might have already. But it's an example of humanity winning once again and AI, in fact, not having taken over the world, at least not yet. So we became aware of a YouTube video recently uploaded where someone had taken their report data, shared it. However, they also shared additional material that was not contained within the, confines of a Blackstone oil report. However, there was no clarification about what was from Blackstone and what wasn't. And the thing was, when we watched the video, we being myself, a couple other analysts on staff, we noticed that the additional materials, which, delved into sources of metal content and a sort of evaluation of the metals and what they showed, it had a little bit of a ChatGPT flavor to it. And here's the thing. At Blackstone, we pride ourselves on having a human behind the keys at every stage of the operation. From the point your sample arrives to when it's unpacked to when it is set up for testing, the actual testing, the results, the analysis, the comment, and finally the report that you are given. Every step of the way, there is someone who is behind the keys, paying attention, not merely to, be on the lookout for any errors during the process, but also providing the analysis and telling you what's going on based on what we have learned, not what a machine has picked up from an algorithm or some sort of tossed off evaluation that an AI bot has generated for you. That's not ever going to be the goal of Blackstone Laboratories. It hasn't been before. It isn't now. And what was frustrating to us about this video in particular is not that the person was sharing their data, because for a brief moment in the video, the report was visible. And we always encourage people to share their report data. It's frankly free advertising to us because we think our report looks good. And the way we lay out the information and the way we have our averages for reference, the should be values for physical properties, a comment telling you what it all means. I mean, that's all very good for us because we're proud of our report and what we can tell people. And we figure that if you want to share it, then by all means, you're welcome to. But in this particular case, the additional materials, I'll just keep referring to them as, it not only wasn't part of the report, part of what Blackstone gives, it was incorrect information. Because in this case, after having some conversation with the content creator, they confirmed that they fed their results, the report in its entirety, through ChatGPT. And then ChatGPT did an evaluation of the results. And they simply ran counter to everything we know to be true about the engine. And I want to hone in on one particular area, and that was bearing material. So when we look at an engine oil sample, we can understand some things about the metallurgy just based on, what's present and what isn't. If you have a more recently designed motor and there is not a single part per million of lead, and we have a dedicated average file that shows us that lead is routinely absent, in general, that's a good indicator that the bearings are aluminum. If we are routinely seeing a complete absence of lead. And for this particular engine type, that again, it was a newer Toyota design, lead is indeed at 0 part per million on average. And if the particular person in question would have asked, we would have come straight out and said, aluminum is your piston and bearing metal in this engine type. However, as I've discussed on previous episodes of the show, so often we run into cases where we didn't know that that was really what they were honing in on. And this was what the person in question was really interested in, was bearing wear. And that's what led to them feeding the results through ChatGPT and then getting these, mostly erroneous conclusions about where the metals were from. And then, a big portion of the video went on to discuss how their bearings looked great because the lead read at 0. And other bearing metals, such as copper and tin, look good too. And that's just what's so frustrating about it is, there's some truth, like copper and tin can show bearing wear, but lead is not going to be your primary bearing metal. And then so our concern there is it can lead people into thinking, A, we provided this additional material, this ChatGPT analysis, and also that it's frankly incorrect information. We don't want people to think that those are our conclusions or that this material is something they can expect in addition to the oil report that's initially pictured on the screen. And again, there just wasn't any clarification about what was ours and what wasn't. So if you have any question about what a Blackstone report looks like, again, if you're new to this, we have a report example on our website, and that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a comment, your results, both in terms of the spectral results, the physical properties, and then, of course, there are resources beyond that, such as a report explanation that is also contained in the email that has your report in it. But if you see any video online with any additional analysis and either the font or the readout or the way the data is displayed, if it does not look like the example report we have on our website and it's proclaiming itself to be Blackstone analysis, be wary and don't necessarily believe. Again, I find it crazy for myself, someone in their mid-30s, to be saying this, but be careful about what you read on the internet. And remember, go to the source and rely on that for what the analysis is actually going to be, what you can expect. And that way, you're not getting the incorrect information, just what we provide based on what we know to be true from the analysis that we do in these walls. So in addition to AI not having won, at least not yet, I do have yet another piece of good news, and that is a video you can find belonging to Double Clutch Auto Reviews. Recently on their channel, Mark uploaded a video titled How to Get a Used Oil Sample on Your Car with Blackstone Laboratories. And I wanted to plug this video for a few different reasons. First of all, Mark does a few things that, frankly, we really appreciate, and I think would provide a valuable resource for many of our listeners. In the video, he not only explains how to obtain a test kit, which is always, a common occurrence on our end for people to be interested in knowing, how do they get a test kit, what's free. And he correctly notes that the analysis itself isn't free, but the kit is, the test kit, as well as the shipping of the test kit. And then he goes into unpacking the kit and explaining what each element is, the purpose it serves. And we really appreciate that too, because while we do provide instructions, I think, watching a demonstration is always helpful because we do have a few different elements in the kit and what purpose they serve. It can be fairly obvious, but if you're new to the world of oil analysis, I think having a demo is helpful. And perhaps best of all, or at least most impressive for me, is seeing, honestly, probably the cleanest sampling procedure you can ask for. He does a very good job of obtaining a sample. And he does it utilizing a few different instruments, which just provide a great example of what's okay. I think a lot of time people obsess with just catching a sample straight from the drain. And if it's not straight from the drain, they worry about contamination. But what he does here, which makes for a very neat and clean process, he takes a sample from the drain using a clean plastic cup. And that way he doesn't have to worry about splash all over the outside of the bottle and making for, just a whole messy transfer process. Instead, clean plastic cup, oil goes in the cup, then it goes into our sample bottle. He also uses a funnel at one point to transfer the two, and that's fine as well. It looked like a clean and dry funnel. And then finally, I would say probably most impressively for someone who's, rather new to oil analysis, the host, Mark, goes through the report and details the results guided by the comment we provide and does it in a very easy to understand way, which is exactly what we want to do. Is we want to give people a comment they can understand. And if someone who's new to oil analysis can also go through and explain their comment to a bunch of strangers on the internet in a very easy to understand way, I mean, that's a great example of just the proof of concept, the process working. Everything we do to provide a report that is accessible. And here is someone who's new to it and is able to understand it and communicate it to other people. So just wanted to give a shout out. Again, you can find this video on YouTube. The title is How to Get a Used Oil Sample on Your Car with Blackstone Laboratories. We'll plug this in the description. It's on the channel, Double Clutch Auto Reviews. Thanks again to Mark for featuring us and for doing such a fine job of explaining the process from start to finish. And we hope to collaborate further on up the road. So that does it for today's show. Hope you enjoyed this 3-piece of YouTube and you, and the ways in which we can interact with Q&As and finding some good and some not so good, and kind of addressing the best ways to digest and communicate the good news of oil analysis. Thanks for hanging with me. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.